Part two of this lecture, we're going to look at fine artists, and we're going to start off with Cubism. And Cubism was basically two artists. They were George Braque and Pablo Picasso. So the Cubist style emphasized the flat, two-dimensional surface of a picture plane, rejecting the traditional technique of perspective, foreshortening, modeling, and chiaroscuro, and refuting time-honored theories of art as an imitation of nature. So when we think about perspective, we think about things going into the picture. So we're going into infinity, all the way back. So we put a point and we bring everything out on that two-dimensional surface. Well, what if the point was not in the picture, but in the front of the picture? In other words, instead of perspective going into the picture, what if it all came out at us, right? Almost three-dimensionally at us. So Cubist painters were not bound to copying anything. They didn't care because they had photography now and they were experimenting. So they didn't need to have the form, the texture, the color, and even the space, as we've just talked about with perspective. They didn't need to copy that. Instead, they decided to present a kind of new reality in paintings that depicted radically fragmented objects whose several sides were seen simultaneously. So we'll start with George Braque. George Braque developed his painting skills while working for his father as a house decorator. He moved to Paris in 1900 to study where he was drawn to work by the Fauve artists, including Matisse and Derain and Dufay, as well as the late landscape artists of Cézanne. He meets Picasso, and that marks a huge turning point in his development. And together, they evolve as the leaders of Cubism. And so when we look at Cubism, we want to think of it as almost a discussion, visual discussion, where Braque would paint something, and then Picasso would respond, and he would paint something. And this went back and forth. So here we're going to look at some of these paintings. So this is Houses at La Estique, and it's from 1908, oil on canvas. It's approximately 28 3/4 inches by 23 1/2 inches. So it's not large like an allegory, but large enough. And there we can see that we've got some floral arrangements, but look at the houses, like how they're sort of truncated and they kind of are all the same color. So we're not really concerned with color. So we're not constrained to color, but we're just sort of constrained to like them coming out at us. And they almost look like little crystals or something, sort of crystalline edges, like they're looking out at us. Here's another, this is the viaduct at La Estique. And there, same kind of thing. We see a little bit more in terms of the houses, but again, we're not looking at a vanishing point going back in space, rather that the vanishing point's kind of coming out at us. And so we see these sort of houses arranged. We've got the viaduct, and then this sort of really like small attempt at sky. Now, if we think about Cézanne, his very tiny brushstrokes, like kind of square, angular brushstrokes, we really see where the Cubists are kind of looking at that. This is 1908. So now let's move on. And they change rather quickly. So here we have Castle at La Roche, and in the summer of 1909, again, fairly large. And there we have like sort of this mountainous area, and there's our bits of the castle sort of coming out at us. And we're getting less and less and less about reality and more and more about this sort of experiment that they're trying to do with shape. And now here we're really full on into Cubism. This is the violin in the picture. So if we kind of look, we can see bits and pieces of the violin, and there we can see bits and pieces of the picture, and maybe some of the room accoutrements, like the wall kind of in the corner and so on. So I'm going to just say, when you think about how we see, when we think about time, do we ever see everything in its entirety? So for example, you're having a conversation with someone, and as you're looking at them, their eyes look away, and then you look at what they looked at. So now, if I were going to draw that person as like a static one moment look, I might have that face in the image, but maybe if I were going to draw it like a cubist, I would have part of the face, maybe a close-up of their eyes, and then I would maybe look at whatever they were looking at, like at this fly on the ceiling. And so I'd sort of fragment all those moments in time, in a particular way. So if we think about this as like as multiple moments in the artist's time, and then sort of put together, fragmented, it seems to make more sense. At least it does to me. So we're really not just talking about a moment that's like one reflected moment, but many, many, many moments where the artist is looking at one shape and then another and another and another. Here's now we're really, this is really towards the end of Cubism, and we're completely full on, and now we almost have different planes. So rather than fragmented objects, it's almost like we have different sheets of paper that are sort of piled up, and we have the different bits that we're looking at different times. And notice how at one moment the woman's looking at us, and the next moment, and that other little up at the top right here, she's kind of looking away. We see bits of her chin, we see her eyes closed, we see her eyes open, all the different things. Right? Bits of the guitar, not in one kind of like guitar shape, but I'm looking at the strings and the resonating hole of the guitar. We're looking at some other things that might be in the room. There for a minute, we've got her fingers up in the bottom, like right by the strings of the guitar. And so it's like a different, so it's just over. And then again, we're not like tied to color. We're not tied to shape. We're not tied to form. We're not tied to any of those things. We're really seeing artists experimenting. And this is so important to us because this is sort of the final letting go of the image and letting the artist, when we look at an image for years and years and years, we look at ancient art, we see the image is supposed to replicate reality, right? And that's our convention. It should look real. But the artists had photography. They didn't need to make it look real anymore. And what were they going to do next? Well, they were going to do what they thought and felt. And so now suddenly the painting can be a painting. It doesn't have to be a replication of reality. It can be the artist's feeling, the artist's thoughts, the artist's heart, the artist's emotion. It doesn't have to be this other thing that's not really real anyways. It's still just canvas and paint and brushstrokes. So after a brief interlude in which he was called up to fight in the First World War, Braque's style developed in the direction he was to follow for the rest of his life, in that he starts to do these kind of really simple landscapes, and he moves away from Cubism entirely. In establishing the principle that the work of art should be autonomous and not an imitation of nature, Cubism redefined art in the 20th century. We cannot underestimate how important that was. Braque's large compositions incorporated the Cubist aim of representing the world as seen from a number of different viewpoints. He wanted to convey a feeling of being able to move around within the painting. So you could see the object, you would move around and you would paint those bits that you focused on. The still life subject remained his chief preoccupation from 1927 to 1955, when he no longer painted. So let's take a look at Pablo Picasso. So this painting depicts 5 naked prostitutes in a brothel. One of them pushes aside a curtain around the space where the other women strike seductive and erotic poses, but their figures are composed of flat, splintered planes rather than rounded volumes like normal, human form would appear. So again, this move away from reality. Their eyes are lopsided or staring or asymmetrical, and the 2 women at the right have threatening masks on their head. The space, too, which should recede, comes forward in jagged shards like broken glass. In the still life at the bottom, a piece of melon slices the air like a scythe. And so this is not really Cubism yet. This is like the last vestiges of reality that Pablo Picasso is painting. And at this time, there was a lot of illness, especially syphilis, which you could get if you were with a prostitute. And so there's a part of this that's about this idea of, this alluring thing that should be, experience that should be really wonderful is really not wonderful. And it could be really quite damaging to you for the rest of your life. So he kind of creates them almost like in a horror position. right? So that's really kind of what the painting is about. And then he moves into this experience with Braque. And there we see the beginnings of Cubism. So here's a man with an accordion, and very much like the woman with the violin that we looked at a moment ago, we can see the bits and pieces of the accordion, maybe the movement of the man playing, and so on. Here's a portrait of Kahnweiler. He was an art dealer at the time, and it was, this sort of look. Let's take a close-up of that. So here's a kind of close-up, and there we see like his coiffed hair, bits of his face, and so on. Here's a woman with a mandolin. So again, remember how I talked about that this was almost like a conversation between the two artists, where one would do one and one would do the other, and they kind of move back and forth. And here we see bits of her, and this kind of like lost expression and sort of facetedness. And then here's a kind of the final, piece. This is Untitled, 1915. So then we start to see Picasso do something really unusual, and that's where he starts to bring in like a lot of different textures and elements, and he even brings in, collage and different, like literally, gluing things to the canvas and on words and all of this other stuff. So it's like this sort of like lash, like goodbye to historicism. So here we have like some historical, like we looked at Louis Sullivan, so here look at these little organic bits that he's kind of got like lying around. And it's like we're saying goodbye to those, we're saying goodbye to all the way that art was always portrayed forever and ever and ever. And now suddenly we're just doing something completely modern. So that's the point. What does it mean to be modern? So let's take a look at Futurism. So this is a movement that comes out of Italy. It was an international art movement, basically founded in Italy in 1909. It was and is a kind of a contrast to the weeping sentimentalism of Romanticism. The futurists loved speed. They had cars now. They loved noise, they loved machines, they loved pollution, they loved cities. They were like excited by all of this. They came from the country, and suddenly here they are in the middle of the city, and all these things are happening. And it was just, for a young person, it was just thrilling. They embraced the exciting new world that was then upon them, rather than being hypocritical, like the arts and crafts movement, which rejected industrialism. We don't like it. Let's go back to the old ways. Let's make everything out of wood. Let's not use metal. Let's carve everything ourselves. Of course, it was way too expensive. People couldn't afford it. Then we move into these other points. So these futurists, they enjoyed the modern comforts of the world. They were kind of denouncing all the things that push them to be historical. Fearing an attacking technology has become almost second nature to many people at that time, and the Futurist Manifesto show us that there's an alternative to that philosophy. So Futurism was first announced on February 20th, 1909, when the Paris newspaper Le Figaro published a manifesto by the Italian poet and editor Philippe Tommaso Marinetti, and that's him in the image there. The name Futurism was coined by Marinetti. He reflected his emphasis on discarding what he conceived to be the static and irrelevant art of the past, and celebrated change and originality and innovation in culture and society. And so again, we glorify this new technology, the automobile, the beauty of its speed, the power and movement. He exalted violence and conflict. He called for sweeping repudiation of traditional cultural values. I mean, they wanted to tear down all cultural institutions, especially museums and libraries. And here we can see kind of an image that he created for the manifesto. Again, sorry about the bad slide, but this is something you probably would have seen anywhere. This, like, you could see this today. The manifesto's rhetoric was bombastic. Its tone was aggressive and inflammatory, and it was purposely intended to inspire public anger and amazement, and to just get people aroused and angry and controversial and attack. It was all about attention. Here's another of his pieces. And this, like, he was a poet, of course, so we've got all these words and different things going on. And one of the artists that painted during this time that became a futurist was Umberto Boccioni. And here's an early portrait of his. You can see he's kind of looking at like Degas and Impressionists. It's a pastel on paper, 1909. And then he moves into the Futurism, and here we are by 1910. Futurism had already written its manifesto, shouted its dogma on words, and its pictures still lacked kind of a language, a modern way to articulate this. So this is a painting called The City Rises by Umberto Boccioni. And it's a case in point. Against the background of Milan, there's this urban background. You can see like the smokestacks and belching smokestacks and, background of smoking chimneys and scaffolding and streetcars and locomotives and enormous draft horses. So this is this gigantic horse. And it's being tugged at its harnesses while street workers are attempting to direct the animals, but they're so big and strong, and look at the people like they're getting blown off, like the horses are going to trample them. Yet the pictorial means of realizing this veneration of all this energy, this titanic energy and industrial activity, are in 1910 sort of like anarchy. It's a prominent role given to the horsepower. And we see that word actually used in terms of what machines can do, this idea of horsepower. Here's another of Boccioni. By the end of 1911, however, Boccioni, like his fellow futurists, had visited Paris, and they had become acquainted with the avant-garde center of Europe. And what did they see when they were in Paris? You guessed it, Cubism. So they went to an exhibition in 1912, and the impact on Cubism on the futurists was immediate and strong. And as suggested by Boccioni's scene here of a railroad station farewell. So the first in his 1911 series called States of Mind and all the different farewells. So here we have, the railway cars, all the sort of faceted bits as they're kind of looking through, but really not Cubism. It's really not. It's like it's affected by Cubism, but it's really still its own thing. And there we see the smoke coming from the train up at the top in the center, and so on. So Boccioni didn't just do painting, he also was a sculptor. And so here's some of his really interesting pieces. This one is called Development of a Bottle in Space. So there he's looking at Cubism. He's taking the bottle and he's kind of building it into facets. And it's really, quite beautiful, 1912. And here, this is probably his most famous piece and probably one of my all-time favorites. And here it is, a human form of a man. And it's this continuity of space and time. And here we can see how the human is like just almost like his muscles are moving in space, and they're almost like wind is like blowing them back. And he's got this like huge, it really looks like something out of a modern day, sci-fi movie. But, it wasn't. It was really this interpretation that Boccioni had of what it meant to be a human being in this most turbulent, industrial, changing, that's the most important part, changing time. So let's look at the next one, and this is called Dada. So virtually every artistic principle and device which underlies literature, music, theater, and the visual arts of our time was promoted, if not invented, by the Dadaists. The use of collage and assemblage, the application of aleatory techniques, the tapping of the artistic resources of indigenous cultures of Africa, America, and Oceania, the extension of the notion of abstract art to literature and film, the breaking of boundaries separating the differences in art forms from one another and from everyday life. So this idea of reality, the notion of art as performance rather than just being like a replication of something, the expropriation of elements of popular culture, the notion of interaction or confrontation with the audience, everything which defines what we loosely call the avant-garde. One would be hard-pressed to name an artistic movement since 1923 that was more impactful. So the Cabaret Voltaire was a place where a lot of the Dadaists gathered. And I want to look first at Hugo Ball. He was born in Switzerland and was considered one of the co-founders of the Zurich Dada. Cafe des Western in Berlin. He met his meeting place with young poets, and he was a collaborator in the periodical revolution. Here we see Ball protesting several times against the humiliating facts of world war in the 20th century. In light of this, all static values of culture appear to him to be questionable. So it's like kind of this idea of like anarchy, if you will. He composed sound poems or verses without words. In 1917, he ceased to take an active part in the Dada movement and became co-editor of the newspaper Freie Zeitung in Bern, which demanded editorially a republic for Germany rather than, a monarchy. Later, he retired and went to live in Ticino, where he was employed on a biography of Bakunin. From his Dada period, an unpublished novel exists. It's called Tenderenda die Fantast. In his criticism of German intelligence, 1919, he tried to present a profound analysis of the German state of mind, which may have literally foreshadowed Hitlerism. One of his other significant works are the diary excerpts of his Dada period published in Die Flucht aus der Zeit, or Flight Out of Time. This is a highly recommended reading for anyone who's interested in the documentation of Dada and its movements in Zurich. So to kind of just sum it up, Dada was an artistic and literary movement that dated from 1916 to 1923 that sought for the discovery of authentic reality through the breaking down of traditional culture and aesthetic forms. It was a group and groups, so there was more than one area that sort of embraced this, that made anti-art or anti-aesthetic creation and participated in protest activity to illustrate their disgust of the bourgeois values or the values of the rich and the despair that people were dealing with over and after the end of the war, of World War I. Dada literally is a French word meaning child's word for a horse. And there's different things that say Dada means different things, but that's one of the interpretations. It was an art movement that flourished primarily in France, Switzerland, and Germany. This movement was based on principles of deliberate irrationality, anarchy, and cynicism, and rejected the laws of beauty and social organization. So you can see how Cubism and the Futurists kind of played right into Dada for the bourgeois and the middle class with its conventional ideas and tastes, values and despair over World War I. And so